Are we as squeezed in as we can be? All right. Well, there's a few more people in some seats down in the very front row. Welcome all, lovers of the essay and lovers of literature. I want to begin by offering humble thanks to the University Writing Program, especially Dean Gary Hatch, and the English Department, our Chair Ed Cutler, and Susan Howe, who coordinates the reading series, and Tessa Hauglet, our secretary, who helps make some of the arrangements. To the library, especially Robert Means and Mike Hill and his students, for their enthusiasm for literature and also financial support of readings such as this. Mostly, of course, a special thanks to Scott Russell Sanders for his generosity and his vast knowledge that he shared with us. Because I cannot disprove the statement I'm about to make, let's say that exactly 10 years ago, this very day, this very hour, recognizing the 2-hour time difference between Provo, Utah and Athens, Ohio, I first encountered Scott Russell Sanders in the Best American Essays 1999 with his essay, Beauty. The entire volume is excellent, with work by Joan Didion, Annie Dillard, Brian Doyle, Ian Fraser, Patricia Hampel, Barbara Hurd, Hilary Masters, Arthur Miller, Joyce Carol Oates, Cynthia Ozick, all writers I love, with several essays that made me the writer I am today and that I still use in my teaching. Because of my habit of reading the anthology in order from start to finish, I would have absorbed all this great work before happening across Sanders, yet I was not sated. Beauty struck me immediately as one of the best essays in the book, and now with the weight of another decade of dedicated study, I believe it is one of the best essays ever. This is how it opens. Quote, "In memory, I wait beside Eva in the vestibule of the church to play my bit part as father of the bride. She hooks a hand on my elbow while 3 bridesmaids fuss over her, fixing the gauzy veil, spreading the long ivory train of her gown, tucking into her bun a loose strand of hair which glows the color of honey filled with sunlight. Clumsy in my rented patent leather shoes and stiff black tuxedo, I stand among these gorgeous women like a crow among doves. I realize they're gorgeous not because they carry bouquets or wear silk dresses, but because the festival of marriage has slowed time down until any fool can see their glory." You may notice here that the narration of a past event is presented in the present tense, a no-no, according to me, and confirmed by Sanders himself in yesterday's lecture. But notice, too, that the move is preceded by that wonderful phrase, "in memory," and that the present tense is used sparingly to highlight this remembered scene. I'll tell you, too, that this is not a memoir about Eva's wedding, though reflection on that event provides the essay's occasion. Soon enough, Sanders leaves the chapel and travels to the very origin of the universe, tackling the Big Bang with this astute connection. Quote, "Without being able to check their equations, I think the physicists are right. I believe the energy they speak of is holy, by which I mean it is the closest we can come with our instruments to measuring the strength of God." The essayist continues his associative gatherings of things spatial, musical, natural, edible, cultural, botanical, artistical, linguistical, theoretical, and so forth, towards a nuanced understanding of that great and mysterious concept, beauty. This was a revelation to me. Sanders had formed a bridge between the classical essay, with its roots in broad-ranging, intelligent thematic exploration, and the contemporary creative nonfiction, with its focus on narrative, scene, and dialogue. Classical essayists wrote on the great profundities of human existence, things like truth and death and fortune and friendship and the pleasures of hating, and that men are justly punished for being obstinate in the defense of a fort that is not in reason to be defended. So did Sanders, more or less. He just lopped the prepositions off his titles. After that first contact with his essays, I sought more, happy to discover that he'd been at it quite a while. And I'm happy to report that he's still at it. He's written essays on spirit and dust and silence and tools and family and skill and fidelity and simplicity. I've still not read every essay Scott Russell Sanders has written, but every Scott Russell Sanders essay I've read has been a joy and an inspiration to me. Everyone has brought me some spark of wonder and enthusiasm, a contagious good feeling about life. So I want to say that Scott Russell Sanders, like the mass of essayists, leads a life of quiet jubilation. For several decades now, he has consistently and passionately observed this strange and wondrous world, offering his struggles towards discovery and meaning in his essays. Today it is our great privilege to accompany him in his thought experiments, and we may hope come to greater insight and enthusiasm for the world around us. Please help me welcome Scott.
Well, I am glad to be at BYU, or the Y. I gather it's the Y, right? And I've had wonderful interactions with students and faculty yesterday and today, and I have further ones today that I'm looking forward to. It's a great privilege to be here, and it is wonderful to be in a place where the essay is thought about, spoken about, taught about, written about with so much passion and intelligence. Pat had written to me before my coming that when I made up my selection of readings that I maybe consider reading from something like Beauty or Dust or some of these other single word essay titles. And without our conniving ahead of time, one of the pieces I chose to read from is Beauty. And so you will hear that passage that he read so well. You'll hear that again in just a few moments. I'm going to read from 3 books, briefly from 3 books. The first is A Private History of Awe, AWE. The second is Hunting for Hope, which is where Beauty appears. And the third is my newest book, A Conservationist Manifesto. This is the opening of A Private History of Awe. The setting, as you will learn, is on a farm outside of Memphis, Tennessee, where I was born. You'll hear my father speak briefly. My father was from Mississippi, and so you will hear a poor imitation of a good Mississippi accent. My mother was from Chicago, and I won't even try Chicago. When my father wrapped me in his arms and carried me onto the screened porch of our farmhouse in Tennessee during a thunderstorm, he said nothing about the booming and blowing, merely hummed a tune, a sound I confused with the purr of rain. It was as though he had swallowed a bit of thunder, which now rumbled in his throat. Mama thrust her head from the doorway and said, "You'll catch a chill." Dad answered, "We're doing just fine." Mama paused skeptically because she believed that disaster could strike at any moment from any direction. She frowned as if doubting she would ever see us again among the living, and then she withdrew inside. Dad tucked me closer and pulled his baggy hunting jacket around me. I shivered against him, less from cold than from excitement. Rain drummed on the tin roof of the porch, rattled in the downspouts, hissed on the new grass with the sound of bacon frying in a pan. Wind hurled twigs and last year's leaves across the yard. This year's leaves, no bigger than the paws on a kitten, were just breaking out on the trees, so it must have been early spring, most likely March. In October, I would turn 5 years old. I had climbed the smaller trees, pecan and persimmon, sweet gum and tupelo, but the huge oak out by the blacktop road I could only gaze at in wonder, for its lowest branches loomed far beyond my reach. It was the tallest thing I knew. Taller than the barn, taller than the windmill in the pasture, taller than the spire on our church. I was watching that oak sway in the storm, its fat limbs thrashing as if it were a sapling, when suddenly a flash and boom split the air. I lurched in my father's arms, and he jumped too, but held me tight. My ears rang. Bumps rose on my skin. I felt a heart pounding, whether Dad's or mine, I couldn't tell. He broke off humming to whistle. "Sweet Jesus, will you look at that?" I blinked, but could see only a white glare. I touched my eyes to make sure they were still in place. Gradually, shapes thickened in the brightness, and I could make out the porch railing, the gravel path stretching away into the yard, the flower bed with petunias bobbing their bedraggled pink heads in the rain. And out by the road, the great oak snapped like a stick. Its top shattered on the ground, a charred streak running down the wet gray stub of the trunk. "What happened, Daddy?" I asked. "Lightning hit the old guy." "Will he die?" "He's done for, buddy. I'll have to cut him up." His voice shook in a way I had never heard before. I asked no more questions, but only snuggled against his chest, craving his warmth and weight. Soon he began humming again, and I could hear the rain pattering more quietly on the porch roof and thunder grumbling farther and farther away, and I could watch lightning flicker beyond cotton fields at the edge of the world. And I could see the oak scattered across the yard, and scraps of bark, broken limbs, and shards of wood the color of bread. One moment the great tree had stood there by the road as solid as my father, bigger than anything else I knew, and the next moment it was gone. That erasure haunts me still. Over half a century later, long after our Tennessee farm vanished under a subdivision and my father died, I still ring with the astonishment I felt that day when the sky cracked open to reveal a world where even grown-ups were tiny and houses were toys and wood and skin and everything was made of light. Well, that is my first detailed memory in my life, and you can understand why it might stick in a person's memory. And it captures this combination of wonder and dread that is what awe is. And it seems to me that that emotion of awe, that complex of fear and amazement, is the single most accurate emotion to feel about our existence. Because we live in a miraculous universe. Our very being is a miracle. Our moment-by-moment existence alongside all the other creatures and in this vast universe is a miracle. But we are also vanishingly small and fragile and temporary in that vastness. And so the emotion that we feel about that when we allow ourselves to think about where we are and what we are, the most accurate emotion to feel, it seems to me, is awe. And this book is a record of the moments in my life that have evoked that. And there are moments in everyone's life that evokes that emotion. And the book, in part, is an invitation for the reader to think about those moments in his or her own life. They're not all as dramatic as this. Here's another one. When I was 16, between my junior and senior years in high school, in Ohio, going to a little consolidated country school, I applied for science camps, 8-week summer camps at universities. And the one I chose to go to was at Indiana University, where I encountered many things for the first time. Classical music I'd never heard before. I'd never seen a live play before. And I had never met a girl my age who was straightforwardly and outspokenly brilliant. I know I had known smart girls before, but they had always carefully disguised the fact. That's what one did in country schools where I grew up and when I grew up. She was also not only brilliant, she was brilliant at science and math, and I'd never known a girl of whom that was true. Again, probably some girls could have done it, but not where I went to school. It wasn't what girls were encouraged to do. And so the single most impressive novelty, I suppose, I encountered that summer was a girl named Ruth Ann McClure, 15 years old. She had skipped a grade in school. Ruth was the first girl I had ever met who confessed to an unapologetic love of books. And the confession came in our first real conversation, which occurred on the opening field trip of science camp. One evening, we all piled into a bus and rode into the hills north of Bloomington, to the university's astronomical observatory. It was a clear night, the stars as distinct and fiery as they had appeared when I first began wearing glasses. Inside the observatory, each of us took a turn at the telescope. I managed to squeeze into line right behind Ruth. And so I was close enough to hear the catch in her breath as she gazed through the eyepiece. When my turn came and my field of vision filled with light from galaxies billions of miles away, I felt dizzy as if I might fall spinning into those unimaginable depths. I wondered how many of those remote suns had already burned out, how many life forms had perished in the time it had taken this light to reach Earth. I pulled away from the telescope to find Ruth studying me, bemused, a wisp of a smile on her face. Whatever she meant by that look, I felt challenged to say something adequate to the wonder she and I had just glimpsed. All I could think of were those proud yet fearful lines from the Psalms. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Quoting the Bible didn't seem the coolest way to approach a desirable girl, however, so I settled for saying, wow. Ruth's smile changed from wispy crescent to full, which might have meant only that she found my utterance to be surpassingly dumb. Still, I chose to be encouraged. After a lecture on astronomy to which I paid scant attention from a seat behind Ruth, we walked back to the bus together, and I found myself more intrigued by the glide of her white tennis shoes over the dew-damp grass than by the sweep of the Milky Way overhead. With a thumping heart, I sat next to her on the bus for the ride back to Bloomington, perhaps sensing that she had an infatuated boy on her hands. Ruth drew from her purse a leaflet we had been given with our other materials for camp, listing 114 books for pre-college reading. I had already taped that leaflet above the desk in my dormitory room, vowing to work my way through from A to Z. Before the driver doused the lights in the overhead lights in the bus, Ruth and I studied the list, comparing notes on the books we had read. Thinking to impress her, I told her how my rocketry had been inspired by Willie Lay's book, The Conquest of Space. Ruth laughed. What a ridiculous title. It's like an ant sitting on its mound of dirt and writing a book called The Conquest of Earth. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how absurd it was for a two-legged mite on this dust mote of a planet to brag about conquering space. Over the course of that summer and over the 4 decades since, Ruth would let the air out of countless gassy notions, quite a few of them mine. But this night on the bus, riding through the starlit Indiana countryside, was the first time I felt the force of her sane, serene, no-nonsense mind. After the lights were doused, we laced the fingers of our hands together and kept on talking about books. Well, on the way home, my dad came and picked me up, about an 8-hour drive away, and on the way home, in a new car that he had just bought, I was distracted a little bit from my misery of overleaving Ruth by this fancy new car. But my dad realized that I was love-struck and sulking. The nearest I came to speaking about Ruth with my father was to ask if he had ever missed a girl so much it hurt. Sure, he told me. He had ached over plenty of girls until he met Mama. And then he made sure he would never have to live apart from her ever again. I asked him, how you know when you found the girl you should never give up? With Mama, he replied, it was like she lit up from inside. There was this crowd of other girls, and then there was Eva Mary. The way he said it made me realize he still saw the love light shining in Mama, an unflagging radiance, as it's shown for me in Ruth. For the last leg of our trip north from Columbus, Dad put down the convertible's top. While he drove, the rush of wind lulled me to sleep. By and by, a roaring and shimmying jerked me awake, and I looked over to see the dial on the speedometer topped out at 120 miles per hour. Dad grinned across at me, let up on the gas pedal, and shouted, "I just wanted to see what you could do." For the moment, I was too happy to be scared, too glad of my father's company to be lonely. Well, I'm jumping over a lot of history. Ruth and I got married. This August, we celebrated our 42nd anniversary. Great joy. We're grandparents now. You'll hear about grandchildren in a few minutes. I did my graduate study in England, and Ruth and I got married just before we went to England. We were there for 4 years, and while we were there, she became pregnant and she had a miscarriage. And we had told all of our friends about this coming baby with great joy and anticipation, and told our parents, of course. And then she had a miscarriage, which is fairly common, especially in early pregnancies, but it's never common for the couple to whom it happens. It's devastating when you lose a child. So when she became pregnant again, 2 years into our time in Indiana, where I took up my teaching position after we came back to the United States, we were wary of telling everybody soon about her pregnancy. And then finally, the obstetrician assured her that she was healthy and the baby was healthy, and you can tell everybody. So we did tell everybody. And the baby was due in January of a year, 1973. But the importance is that January 1st of that year was the first day that fathers would be allowed in the delivery room in Bloomington, Indiana Hospital. It's hard often for young people to realize that recently in a university town, up to that date, fathers had been excluded. Doctors were afraid they'd go crazy or pass out or just do something stupid. And part of the preparation for the delivery of the baby was that my wife and I took pre-birth classes, and there are a variety of them. The one we took is still taught. It's called Lamaze. It's one of the methods. And while I was taking it, the husband is taught all sorts of things he can do to coach the mother, to remind her to breathe and to cool her forehead and to give her little chips of ice to suck on. And while I was being taught these things, I had the illusion it was so that I would actually contribute to the process. But actually what it's meant to occupy the father so that he doesn't pass out or run around and be crazy, and to give him the illusion that he actually has a role in the birth of the child other than helping to bring it in a way that we're all familiar with, or at least we know in theory if we don't know in practice. But anyway, you'll hear a couple references to my coaching Ruth in this. It's a little passage. One Sunday afternoon in the third week of January, Ruth was knitting a pair of booties, not pink, not blue, but meadow green, while I read about the latest sorrows in the newspaper. Every now and again, her fingers grew still, her breathing sped up, and I knew she was feeling a contraction. I would glance at my watch and then glance again the next time she paused in her knitting. 12 minutes apart, 10 minutes, 8. No need to call the doctor until they began arriving every 5 minutes or less. She had been feeling contractions off and on for a week, so neither of us spoke of them now. We didn't need to speak. Our bodies were so attuned. She had no appetite for the supper I cooked, and therefore neither did I. Not because the supper was my usual amateur fare, but because Ruth had completely filled her skin, and she could take in nothing more until this new child swam out of her. She kept shifting her weight in the chair, trying to find a point of comfort, and I kept looking at her as I watered plants on the windowsill and swept the floor. When she grabbed the edge of the table, I said, "Remember to breathe, sweetheart." Ruth nodded and then fell into the shallow panting we had practiced. After the pain eased, she tried smiling at me, but her lips wouldn't cooperate. Is this it?" I asked. "I think so. I hope so." "Let's walk," I suggested. She stood and looped an arm around my waist and leaned against me. And as we paced in slow circles through the apartments, I rubbed her lower back. Every time we passed the cradle, she reached out and set it rocking. Whenever a contraction made her stop, I stopped with her, and then I moved again when she lifted her foot, as if she were leading me in a dance. When the pains began coming 5 minutes apart, regular and hard, I called the doctor, who was already at the hospital delivering another baby. By the time he returned my call, the interval between contractions was down to 3 minutes. And the doctor told me not to break the speed limit, but also not to dawdle in getting to the hospital. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror where I could see the moon, perhaps 2 or 3 days past full, rising into a clear night sky, trying to imagine our child, an astounding phrase, our child. I thought of the full Earth photographed from Apollo 17, this drop of life shining against the lifeless dark. I remembered watching the screen in Cambridge as a human stepped for the first time onto the moon's cold, dusty surface, and then seeing through a window the untelevised moon setting in the west. I remembered the night during science camp when I stood in line at the observatory behind a girl named Ruth, breathing in her scent, my heart pounding, and then took my turn, gazing through the telescope at unimaginably ancient and distant galaxies. I remembered yearning to understand the forces that shaped the universe, yearning to build a spaceship and venture out there myself, a longing that stretched back through my childhood, back to a time before I learned of Bibles or bombs, before I could read, before I had acquired much past or dreamed up any future, perhaps as far back as the instant when lightning shattered the oak while my father held me tight in his arms. In the delivery room, Ruth's hand squeezed mine as she pushed. I was amazed by her grip, as I had been amazed in childhood by my father's giant strength. Why had fathers been kept out of the delivery room in our hospital until this very month? And why were they still kept out of most delivery rooms? I was grateful to be here with Ruth, feeling the pressure of her hand, hearing her fierce breath. The effects of her pushing were visible in a mirror mounted at the foot of the birthing couch, the mouth of her womb gradually opening. I sat on a stool beside her, and with my free hand, I wiped a damp cloth over her forehead, and fed her chips of ice, and rubbed salve on her lips. The hard labor lasted from 1 a.m. until nearly 4, and all the while I bent down and murmured in Ruth's ear, the words rising from a place I had not known was inside me. Ruth called back to me from a place I had not known was inside her. A run of grunts and laughter and shouts, culminating in an exultant roar when the baby's head emerged with eyes blinking at the lit-up world, gray eyes in a red face, and with a tiny mouth that sucked in air before letting out a roar of her own, and then both shoulders emerged, then the arms wildly waving, and then quickly the whole child, torso and legs and wriggling feet, a dancing girl, bound by her umbilical cord all the way back to the source of life. And then Ruth was holding Eva Rachel on her chest and bellowing right along with the baby, mother and child singing the oldest song. Another significant jump to that scene that Pat read a piece of. A chapter on beauty that goes, as he suggested, goes all over the place. It goes into mathematics, and it goes into the Big Bang and photographs from space and scientific formulas and elsewhere. But it starts with memories of my daughter's wedding, Eva's wedding, Eva, whose birth you just heard. So I'm repeating a little bit of what Pat read. In the weeks and months since Eva's wedding, I have parceled out my joy into its elements, remembering the music, the flowers, the gowns and tuxedos, the friends whispering under the vaulted ceiling of the church. I can see the 4 grandmothers walking gingerly down the aisle, clutching the arms of ushers. Ruth dabbing a handkerchief to her eyes as Jesse, that's my son, as Jesse leads her to a seat. Jesse beaming and his blonde hair, newly shorn of dreadlocks, gleaming. I see the groomsmen filing out with Matthew to stand expectantly near the altar, Matthew smiling through his beard as he gazes up the aisle for a glimpse of his bride. The bridesmaids in the dresses of midnight blue gathered around the shining face of my daughter. In memory, I wait beside Eva in the vestibule to play my bit part as father of the bride. She is supposed to remain hidden from the congregation until her queenly entrance, but in her eagerness to see what's going on up front, she leans forward to peek around the edge of the half-closed door. The satin roses appliqued to her gown catch the light as she moves, and the toes of her pale silk shoes peep out from beneath the hem. The flower girls watch her every motion. They are twins, a few days shy of their third birthday, and they flounce their unaccustomed frilly skirts, twirl their bouquets, and stare with wide eyes down the great length of carpet leading through the avenue of murmuring people. Eva hooks a hand on my elbow while the bridesmaids fuss over her, fixing the gauzy veil, spreading the long ivory train of her gown, tucking into her bun a loose strand of hair which glows the color of honey filled with sunlight. Clumsy in my rented finery, patent leather shoes that are a size too small, and starched shirt and stiff black tuxedo, I stand among these gorgeous women like a crow among doves. I realize they are gorgeous not because they carry bouquets or wear silk dresses, but because the festival of marriage has slowed time down until any fool can see their glory. Concerned that we might walk too fast, as we did in rehearsal, Eva demonstrates once more a gliding ballet step for us to use as we process down the aisle. Slide the sole of one foot forward, bring the feet together, pause, slide, feet together, pause, all in rhythm with the organ. It's really simple, Daddy, she says as I botch it again and again. On an ordinary day, I would have learned the step quickly, but this is no ordinary day, and these few furtive seconds of instruction in the vestibule are not enough for my pinched feet. I fear that I will stagger like a wounded veteran beside my elegant daughter. Eva, meanwhile, seems blissfully confident not only of being able to walk gracefully as she could do in her sleep, but of standing before this congregation and solemnly promising to share her life with the man who waits in thinly disguised turmoil at the far end of the aisle. Poised on the dais, a step higher than Matthew, below the mystifying wooden cross, wearing a black ministerial robe and a white stole, is the good friend whom Eva and I know best as our guide on canoe trips through the Boundary Waters. He grins so broadly that his full cheeks push up against the round rims of his spectacles. There's one happy preacher, Eva says. He believes in marriage, I reply. So do I said. So do I, says Eva. I remember Matt and I figured out that between you and Mom and his folks, our parents have been married 58 years. Eva lets go of my arm to lift a hand to her throat, touching the string of pearls she has borrowed from Ruth. The necklace was a 16th birthday gift to Ruth from her own parents, who have now been married over half a century all by themselves. Love can be durable, I'm thinking. As Eva returns her free hand to my arm and tightens her grip, the arm she holds is my left one, close against my racing heart. On her own left arm, she balances a great sheaf of flowers, daisies and lilies, marigolds, snapdragons, the gift of a friend who grows these in her garden. But so far, and in her left hand, she holds a Belgian lace handkerchief also borrowed from Ruth, in case she cries. But so far there's no welling of tears in those bold brown eyes. The organ strikes up Jesu, joy of man's desiring, for the bridesmaid's entrance. And down the aisle they skim, those gorgeous women in midnight blue. The organist is another friend, the former choir director of our church, an old pro whose timing and touch are utterly sure, and likewise a gracious man who has postponed open heart surgery until next week in order to play for Eva's wedding. He tilts his head back to read the music through bifocals, then tilts it forward to study the progress of the bridesmaids, then tilts it back again as he raises the volume a notch for the entrance of the flower girls. The flower girls, overawed by the crowd, hang back until their mother nudges them along, and they spy their father waving eagerly at them from the third row of seats, and then the twins dash and skip, carrying the fronds of flowers like spears. Finally, only the bride and the father of the bride remain in the vestibule. Eva whispers, "Remember now, don't walk too fast." But how can I walk slowly while my heart races? I have forgotten the ballet steps she tried to show me. I want events to pause so that I can practice the step, so that we can go canoeing once more in the wilderness, so that we can sit on a boulder by the sea and talk over life's mysteries, so that I can make up to my darling for anything she may have lacked in her girlhood. But events do not pause. The organ sounds the first few bars of Purcell's trumpet voluntary, our cue to show ourselves. We move into the open doorway and 200 faces turn their lit eyes on us. Eva tilts her face up at me, quirks the corners of her lips into a tight smile and says, "Here we go, Daddy." And so, lifting our feet in unison, we go. And then this is just the final paragraph of that chapter on beauty. I am convinced there is more to beauty than biology, more than cultural convention. It flows around and through us in such abundance and in such myriad forms as to exceed by a wide margin any mere evolutionary need. Which is not to say that beauty has nothing to do with survival. I think it has everything to do with survival. Beauty feeds us from the same source that created us. It reminds us of the shaping power that reaches through the flower stem and through our own hands. It restores our faith in the generosity of nature. By giving us a taste of the kinship between our own small minds and the great mind of the cosmos, beauty reassures us that we are exactly and wonderfully made for life on this glorious planet, in this magnificent universe. I find in that affinity a profound source of meaning and hope. A universe so prodigal of beauty may actually need us to notice and respond, may need our sharp eyes and brimming hearts and teeming minds in order to close the circuit of creation. Well, Eva, in turn, has become a mother twice over. She has a 6-year-old daughter named Elizabeth and a 2-year-old daughter named Margaret. And I repeated with Eva when she was a baby, and I have repeated with her permission with both of her daughters what my father did with me. And this is the epilogue to a private history of awe about doing that. Born in the depths of winter, Eva met snow before she met rain. As spring flamed up in our neighborhood, I took her outside to meet the fresh grass, the flowers, the birds, the wind. Here is the sun, I told her, and here is the moon. From the window of her bedroom at night, I showed her the stars. Then in April, I bundled her in a blanket and carried her onto our porch to meet a thunderstorm, as my father had carried me when I was still small enough to ride in his arms. I sang to her as my mother had sung to me, and between lullabies, I named the blooms we could see nodding in the rain: azaleas, bluebells, dogwood, forsythia, redbud, names my mother had given to me. I was simultaneously a child, remembering my parents, and a man holding my own child. The baby shivered, and I shivered with her as rain thrummed on the roof above us. Mist blew on our faces. Lightning cracked the sky. This is what you are made of, I told Eva. This water, air, earth, fire. You are a sprout from this astonishing ground. May you live long and well with a heart full of awe. Ruth watched these maneuvers from indoors, wearing an indulgent smile, never asking what I murmured to our child, trusting me to protect Eva from harm. 30 Aprils later, Eva was the one who showed trust in me as I carried her newborn, Elizabeth Rachel, only a few days old, onto the porch of Eva and Matt's house to meet thunder and lightning and sizzling rain. Wrapped in a baby quilt that Ruth had made, Elizabeth dozed through most of the storm while I sang lullabies. Then a nearby flash and boom opened her eyes for a few seconds, long enough for me to tell her what I had told Eva all those years before. This is what you are made of, little one. Fire, air, water, earth. This is your marvelous home. And then one little excerpt, and I'll close. The last piece in my new book, A Conservationist Manifesto, is in the form of a letter addressed to children of the future. So I've been giving you, as you have gathered, a reading of threads, one particular family's threads, but it's the human story of parents to children, to grandchildren, to great-grandchildren, and the passing on of the legacies of teachings and also the liabilities of our mistakes. And so this last essay in the book, and the last thing I'm going to read, and I'm only going to read a little piece of it, is in the form of a letter to children of the future, not any particular child or children, but just expressing my hopes for them and my concerns for them. I worry that the choices all of us make today in our homes and workplaces and offices and legislatures will leave fewer choices for you and your own children and grandchildren 50 or 100 years from now. By indulging our taste for luxuries, we may deprive you of necessities. Our laziness may cause you heavy labor. Our comfort may cause you pain. I worry that the world you find will be diminished from the world we enjoy. Thoughts of you make me reflect soberly on how I lead my life. When I spend money, when I turn the key in my car, when I vote or refrain from voting, when I fill my head or belly with whatever is for sale, when I teach my students or write books, ripples from my actions spread into the future, and sooner or later they will reach you. So I bear you in mind. I try to imagine what sort of world you will inherit, and when I forget, when I serve only my own appetite, more often than not, I do something wasteful. By using up more than I need, I add to the flames that are burning up the blessings I wish to preserve for you. If Earth remains a blessed place in the coming century, you will hear crickets and locusts churring away on summer nights. You will hear owls hoot and whippoorwills lament. You will smell wet rock, lilacs, new mown hay, peppermint, lemon balm, split cedar, piles of autumn leaves. On damp mornings, you will find spider webs draped like handkerchiefs on the grass. You will watch dragonflies zip and hover, then flash away so fast, their wings thinner than whispers. You will watch beavers nosing across the still waters of ponds, wild turkeys browsing in the stubble of cornfields, and snakes wriggling out of their old skins. If we take good care in our lifetime, you will be able to sit by the sea and watch the waves roll in, knowing that a seal or an otter may poke a sleek brown head out of the water and gaze back at you. The skies will be clear and dark enough for you to see the moon waxing and waning, the constellations gliding overhead, the Milky Way arching from horizon to horizon. The breeze will be sweet in your lungs, and the rain will be innocent. The rain has reached me now, out in the backyard, sitting under this old maple tree. Rare drops at first, rattling the leaves over my head. There's scarcely a pause between lightning and thunder, and every loud crack makes me jump. It is time for me to get out from under this big old tree and go inside to keep this paper dry. So a few more words, my darlings, and then goodbye for now. Thinking about you draws my heart into the future. I want you to look back on those of us who lived at the beginning of the 21st century and know that we bore you in mind. We cared for you, and we cared for our fellow tribes, those cloaked in feathers or scales or fur, those covered in leaves and bark. One day it will be your turn to bear in mind the coming children, your turn to care for all the living tribes. The list of wild marvels I would save for you is endless. I want you to feel wonder and gratitude for the glories of earth. I hope you will come to see and feel, as I do, that we are already in paradise, right here and now. Thank you very much.